So yeah, appreciate the invitation to be with you guys this afternoon. So Craig asked me to come over and talk just a little bit on, we've been visiting a lot with folks this winter about drought implications in terms of planning for nutrient management going into this cropping season. So we'll hit just a few high points on that, and then a few. Most of the time, I feel like I'm getting pretty far east by the time I'm to Russell County to use much of my cropping systems information. But for as dry as we are, maybe we'll touch on a few things there. So, so my name is Lucas Haag. I'm an extension agronomist based out of Colby. Work out of Tribune as well, and I cover basically not quite the Highway 81 and west, and then north of Highway 96. So. And then here in recent years, been doing a little more of our nutrient management stuff. So Dorvar, Riaz Diaz, and I, and have been covering a lot of the fertility management work. But yeah, so I guess back you guys were quizzing Keith here. So in case you're not familiar with how it's structured, so Keith is at Hayes, and then of course you guys got your ranch with that at HB, and then up north of town as well. And then I work at Colby and Tribune, and then we also got facilities at Garden City. So that's kind of how we're organized. And then where you guys are at in this part of the world, on the crop production side, sometimes we also look up to work coming out of Belleville too. Sometimes can be so Scott Dooley's the agronomist in charge up at Belleville, Scandia.
So what's the blue versus the white?
Oh, that's local. So the counties that are in blue are part of a district. Counties that are in white are single county extension. Yep. So you guys are fortunate to be in a district here. So one of the biggest things we've just been trying to get information out on is we're rolling out new nitrogen recommendations for corn and sorghum. This has been a long time work in progress. Here a couple of years ago, there's a group of us at K-State that worked together on our recommendations. We sat down and had a conversation about, if we started with a blank sheet of paper and just started completely over, what would our recommendations look like? And part of that is you go into the Corn Belt, they've taken, here in recent years, we've seen kind of a different approach be taken. They call it maximum return to nitrogen. So if you've picked up any of the farm magazines, you've probably heard that referred to. So they tend to be state specific. They don't take into account things that we're used to using in our nitrogen recommendations. So profile nitrate credit, a mineralization credit from the organic matter. So that's mostly back in the Corn Belt. North Dakota State does a system that's kind of a mix of that, and then what we would call a mechanistic approach. And that historically is what we've used in Kansas. As well as University of Nebraska, Oklahoma State, Colorado State, Servitec, American Ag Labs at McCook. Traditionally have all used kind of more of this mechanistic type approach. We want to take a look and say, does it make sense for us to stick with that, or should we do something more in line with what the Corn Belt states are doing? And the one thing that if we think about that mechanistic approach, our overall philosophy, what we're trying to do is we're saying, okay, for a given yield goal or yield potential, what's the maximum amount of nitrogen that plant has to uptake at its peak during the season? Okay, so we typically got yield goal times some factor, so that represents what's the peak nitrogen uptake of that crop, and then we subtract off the various credits. So how much profile nitrate did we start with? How much nitrogen are we going to get from soil mineralization? Did we use manure? Are we following an alfalfa crop? All those other credits that can affect how much nitrogen is available. And one of the common things we hear, sometimes people refer to this as a removal-based system, and that's really not true, because nothing in here has anything to do with how much nitrogen we're removing in the grain. All we're trying to do is make sure we meet the maximum uptake needs of that crop. It really has nothing to do with removal. Yeah, Mark.
Well, with nitrogen being soil mobile based on moisture, isn't the drought going to affect some of that?
You're so far ahead.
Oh,
We'll come around to that. Anyway, so it's not really a removal based system. So what's behind the scenes in our recommendation? Well, nitrogen work is messy. This is a glimpse at some of the raw data behind our new recommendation system. And how do we do this in the field? Well, so we do nitrogen rate studies. We'll go 0, all the way up to whatever, exceeding the maximum for that location in 30-pound increments or something like that. So we grow these plots. We go out, we take whole plant biomass samples, run them through a chipper shredder, dry that down to the oven, and then measure what the nitrogen content of that plant was. We know what the weight of that plant was, and so if we got concentration and weight, we know how many pounds of total nitrogen that corn or sorghum plant had taken up. Tie that back to yield, and we get curves like this. And so this is just looking at grain yield. This is for corn. Grain yield is the vertical axis, and then total nitrogen uptake is the horizontal axis. So we can fit some relationships to that. The one thing that's new in our recommendations that you can see here is the irrigated data is in blue, the dryland data is in red. Historically, we have not treated irrigated and dryland separately, even though we knew that probably wasn't right. Irrigated corn just inherently tends to be more efficient. We raise more pounds of corn per pound of N on irrigated. Why would that be? If we got irrigation, what hopefully are we reducing or eliminating? Stress, right? Water stress, probably some heat stress, and so that allows that plant in an irrigated scenario allows it to be more efficient with the nitrogen input. So the first time we'll be splitting out, at least on the corn side, dryland and irrigated separately. That's a big change for us. The abbreviated version of this, ultimately, we've decided to stick with the mechanistic approach. Part of that is we just need that flexibility because of how the wide range of yield potential and scenarios that we have in Kansas. If you think about the state of Iowa, their yield potential, their yield goal across the state doesn't really vary that much. As opposed to in Kansas, we need a system that can handle a recommendation for 50, 60 bushel dryland corn at Syracuse and also be able to handle 300 bushel irrigated up at Scandy. And so we needed a system that had lots of flexibility. Also, to handle our wide range of soil types, we go everywhere from blow sand to heavy silt loam. That's got different mineralization capabilities. We needed to be able to take that into account. And probably one of the biggest things, and Marvin, this comes back to your comment about the dry conditions, comes back to profile nitrate. But again, looking at the recommendation systems back in the Corn Belt, there's nowhere in their system to put a profile nitrate test number in. Why would that be? What happens to their profile nitrate over the winter? Leaches. It ends up in Des Moines drinking water if you've been following the news for the last 10, 20 years, right? And so they're in a very different environment in the fact that they essentially hit the reset button every winter in terms of whatever nitrate was left in the profile. Well, here we know even in our wetter years, we have the ability to retain a fair amount of nitrate in the soil profile. And in years like this, we know that we retain virtually all of it in the profile. So
I pulled a soil sample the other day, 8 inches deep. Tech told me that still had 120 pounds of nitrogen.
I don't surprise me one bit.
Really? I've never seen it. The other one had 70, and I about fell out of my chair.
No, that don't surprise me a bit. We had one here a couple of years after, what year it was, but we had some stuff coming back in Rooks and Phillips counties. They were showing 250, 60 pounds in a 24-inch sample. Wow. I mean, they could raise, even in normal years, they could go a couple rotation cycles and not, assuming that they don't lose any of it, not need another pound of it. Yeah, no, we're seeing quite a bit of that. And so the challenge is people ask, so someone calls and they say, well, my corn or my sorghum failed out. How much of that nitrogen is still there? Well, even from Colby, you can drive 5 miles any direction from Colby, and we've got every extreme from Okay, it got this big and died, or it got this big and died, or it got this, well, again, that's gonna play a pretty big role into how much of that nitrogen is available, because how much of that got taken up and is now tied up in that residue. You know, stuff,
Got baled and sold.
oh yeah, and stuff that was baled off the field, well,
Yeah.
we know that nitrogen's gone. But in terms of the stuff that's still in the field, you know, the stuff that got that big and died, we still got a lot of it in the soil. But if, you know, you basically made it, you know, all the way to boot and sorghum, or all the way to tassel, silk and corn, and then it died, well, we still got a fair bit in the profile, but we also have a lot of nitrate tied up in that residue, and it's gonna take time, you know, for that to cycle. We're not gonna lose it, but it's gonna take time for it to cycle back into the system.
How risky is it to depend on that soil nitrate reading? And as you say, take that off of what you need to go buy and reintroduce.
Yeah, so, you know, that's a good question. Here, we'll come back here right in 1 second. We'll revisit that as part of this other conversation. So here's the new, does anyone in here grow corn? I can skip the corn stuff. I know you're involved in it, but it's like the 10th time you've seen these slides, so you should be able to give this talk. So here, we'll skip corn. Let's go on to, we're not gonna dwell on the economics. Oh, maybe I don't have the sorghum slide in here. Darn it. I do not. That's an oversight on my part. I should have had the sorghum slide in here. Well, we can get this, if you guys are wanting to look at the sorghum one, I can get that to Craig. And our new official pub is not out yet. It's tied up in editing, but I've been given the slides to anybody who wants to use them, and we've got people using the new recommendations this year. Here's the big differences we're making though. I mentioned on corn, we're splitting out irrigated, non-irrigated. On sorghum, we're not doing that. We don't have enough data and sorghum to separate out the irrigated and dry land. So it's still the same recommendation for both irrigated and dry land. Here's the other big changes, fertilizer recovery efficiency. So buried in our old recommendations was basically, and what we're talking about here is of the fertilizer I apply, what % of that am I going to recover in the crop that year? Okay. And what this really goes back to is, okay, after we apply nitrogen, what are all the things that can happen to it? Most of them bad. Can volatilize. What's that?
The immobilization.
Mobilization, not really a loss, but it makes it unavailable, right? Volatilization, we talked about leaching earlier, okay? Erosion, we could physically lose it. We don't think about it as much here, but we move even more into central Kansas. Denitrification. It's hard to think about ponded water, but that can be an issue, right? So we've got all these loss factors. Well, what are some of the things we can do? And I would say, you know, certainly, you know, here west, volatilization by far is our biggest risk factor. And so, you know, what can we do to combat that? Well, we can get it placed below the soil surface. And part of that then is, okay, what % of that nitrogen can the plant recover? Well, if we lose it, we obviously can't recover it. That hurts our efficiency. So in our old recommendations, essentially buried in there, it wasn't explicit, but there was an implied recovery efficiency of about 50%. Okay. And we recognize that a lot of our producers are doing better than that today. 50% is pretty poor. That would be like East Central Kansas, fall applied surface urea or something, you know, or anhigh in really poor conditions. So what we're trying to do, and this is kind of our first attempt at it, we're hoping to get, you know, to where there's even more options, but we want to give you the opportunity to get a recommendation that's more specific to how you manage, how you're putting the fertilizer on, when you're putting it on. And this is our first crack at it. So we let you pick a fertilizer recovery efficiency. So the range there is from about 55% to 70%. Okay. So again, 55% would be like broadcast fall applied. We don't have a lot of that goes on here. But then, you know, other options within that range. So maybe we put it all on pre-plant. You know, if we're doing a pre-plant coulter rig, that's going to be closer into that 65-70% range. If we're doing it right at, if we're injecting it right at planting time, or if we're doing some type of split application, or if we're under irrigation and we're doing fertigation, that would get us closer to that 70% efficiency. Okay, so we're giving you the option to kind of put in your own situation there to adjust that recommendation. And then the second piece of this goes back to your question, Marvin, about, okay, I've got this profile nitrate sample. How much of that do I think I can actually use, or can I count on? And so this is that soil, basically a nitrate recovery efficiency. And we only got two categories on there right now, but basically we're saying if we're in medium textured soils, so if we're in a silt loam of some sort, or anything that's got any clay in it, or if I'm in Western Kansas, we're giving that a value of 1. I'm saying, our assumption is we're going to recover. If it's showing up on the test, it's recovering. Now, if we're in Eastern Kansas, or if we're on some really coarse textured soils, we're backing that off to 70%. That we think we'll recover out of that sample. This is our first step. Ideally, where we want to go with this is a lot more options. And so what we envision someday is, like on the fertilizer efficiency, would be kind of a grid of how am I applying it and when am I applying it, and maybe even, central, east, central, and western Kansas. And you'd actually have a more specific efficiency for what you're doing and when you're doing it and where you're located. That's the next iteration of this. And then the same way on the nitrate recovery efficiency, same thing. I think what we're envisioning is something kind of based on crop reporting district and soil type. So if I'm on a silt loam and this would be the central crop reporting district, our recovery efficiency is X. And so that's our goal is, the old system, it was one number across the whole state. Or, one formula across the whole state. It didn't matter if he's in Cherokee County or Colby irrigated or Syracuse dryland, it was the same system. And our goal is to get this to where it's more farm and management specific. So we can get you the numbers on the sorghum deal, but yield goal still goes in here. That's what EY is expected yield goal, and then you put the efficiency factors in there, and these efficiency factors are the same for sorghum as they are corn. Okay, so you got yield goal, efficiency factors, and you subtract off the credit from your profile nitrate test. Mineralization credit is staying the same. So for our warm season crops, 20 pounds credit per percent of organic matter. So you've got a 2% organic matter soil. We're taking a 40 pound credit there.
So that middle part, fertilizer recovery efficiency, that's going to address whether it's like broadcast urea on the surface versus 1040 in the fertilizers.
Yep, exactly. So, what I think, our biggest range here, so I don't think there's any, don't correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we do any fall applied nitrogen here for spring row crop, do we? I don't think I don't think so. But, if we think about, doing broadcast urea in February, March, is probably, well, not necessarily a bad practice. That's probably less efficient than culturing on UAN at planting time. Right. And so that might be the difference between, say, a 60% recovery efficiency and a 70% recovery efficiency. That's some of the things we're trying to get hammered down. We're actually next year starting a huge project looking at volatilization in dryland sorghum. And we'll have sites across the state here. We'll probably end up with one somewhere. Russell, Ellsworth, one of these counties over in here will be one. I think Hayes is going to be a site. So we want to get at this volatilization piece to get a better idea of, okay, what is the difference between broadcast UAN, broadcast urea, injected UAN? That's kind of our three most common practices in my mind. To actually get at how much are we losing. And so they just finished up some work in wheat in one of those sites over by Salina. And this was with the, like, for example, the untreated urea didn't have any agritane or anything on it. You know, they had a couple scenarios over there where we were losing about, out of 100-pound application, we had lost about 35 pounds to volatilization for a wheat top dress.
You know, the other thing I wonder about too, is when we stream on UAN, that's half urea, and most guys don't ever think about putting an inhibitor like that.
Yeah, or the flip side of it is if you can buy UAN as the same price per pound as urea, you always buy the UAN because you're getting an inhibitor on half your pounds for free, basically.
What is UAN?
So it'd be like your 32.0 or 28.0. So if we think about UAN, actually stands for urea ammonium nitrate. And I'm just old enough to remember when we used to have ammonium nitrate as an option, because what was the big benefit of it?
It doesn't
It doesn't volatilize, right? And so that's the nice thing about liquid UAN is you know, about half of that nitrogen already is, you know, protected
But if
against
you're
volatilization.
trading on 60 units, it's still worth protecting 30.
Yeah. No, I that's something that yeah, that's,
And some guys will say, well, no, it hits the soil and it adheres to the soil. And I say, well, it's still on the surface, it's still exposed to moisture and sunlight.
well, and most of our row crop is going into wheat stubble. And if you've got very decent stubble out there, how much of it is, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's getting to the soil, but a lot of it's hitting the stubble too. Yeah. And so that's, you know, so we talk about the, you know, UAN having less volatilization potential, but on the other hand, there's also times I kind of like the idea of urea because those prills kind of plinko their way down to the ground and get to the soil surface. So anyways, that's why we're going to do some trials.
Can I just ask a stupid question?
There are none.
I know nothing about corn. So are you telling me that if I were to raise corn, I really don't have to care what brand or whatever else of corn, all I really need to be concerned about is this?
Oh, no, there's lots of things we got to take into.
It's like that. What kind of I'm using would determine what I'm going to do. But it
Oh,
sounds to
okay.
me like saying that it doesn't, it's regardless.
Yeah, no, so you bring up an important question because, I mean, there is a lot of discussion about different hybrids out on the market, both in corn and sorghum. There are some genetic differences in hybrids and how nitrogen use efficient they are. The challenge is we have such rapid turnover in hybrids. It's really difficult to well, yeah, it's really by about the time you figure out that, hey, this hybrid's a little more nitrogen use efficient than this one, they're both gone from the market. And so it doesn't matter. There's already new hybrids out. And so no, we do know there are genetic differences amongst both corn and sorghum hybrids in terms of how efficient they are with nitrogen. It's very difficult to quantify that. And those differences, they're real, but they're pretty small in comparison to the overall picture.
Okay, I planted sorghum before, okay? And through that process, after everything's been cut, baled, and you do whatever you do, you take it in. It's too hot to feed. Now tell me why.
Yeah, so that's the other reason we'd want to manage, and I don't have any forage sorghum stuff in here, I don't think, but that's the other thing of why we'd want to manage our nitrogen situation on forage sorghum more carefully, because if we have surplus nitrogen in the system,
Right.
that contributes to having high nitrates in our forage sorghum. And so back to this example of, okay, you got the soil test that says I've got 140 pounds of nitrate in my top 6 inches or whatever.
Right.
That's more than enough nitrogen to raise a typical forage crop for this area. And so you're already a little bit at risk of a high nitrate situation in your feed just because of how much residual nitrate it was already in the soil. Yeah, even if you didn't apply anything.
During the drought, you get more of that nitrogen in the plant than
Exactly.
on a wet year, correct?
Yes, you do.
The plant that takes. And the plant then uses it to grow. If you don't have water for it to grow, the nitrate just sits in the plant and doesn't get put into nitrogen for building blocks of protein for making plant parts, for making leaves and enzymes and grain eventually. just sits there because there's no growth. And he still uptakes.
Yeah. You end up with a higher concentration
Yeah.
because the drought restricts the growth of the plant. Yeah.
So in a drier year, if you're gonna be planting feed for your cattle, you don't wanna really put no nitrogen down, so it don't accumulate in your plant.
Well, no, I mean, I think it really drives home the importance you know, typically, or my bias is, I don't think we do as much soil testing ahead of our feed crops as we do our grain crops. And I would suggest it's probably even more important on our feed crops, because on a grain crop, there's no penalty for having too much. On a feed crop, there is. It's back to this issue of you got something you can't feed because it's too hot. And so, yeah, no, I think it really drives home the importance of doing some, you know, some profile soil testing and stuff, because flip side is, well, we want to raise all the tons we can, right? We need the feed. But yet we also, it has to be something we can actually feed. And so we certainly, so the answer isn't necessarily don't put on any nitrogen, because maybe we do need to make sure we get the growth. But we certainly don't want to get in a situation where we're too hot. Yep. So, no, those are great questions. I don't know if I was hoping I had forage sorghum stuff in here. I don't think I do. We've talked about a little bit about this already. So about this profiling carryover. You know, what gives us a higher probability of that? Of course, our medium fine textured soils, because they hold on to that nitrate more. Recent history of excessive nitrogen rates. And here's the big one, of course, that we're facing right now. What was the situation with the previous crop? Did we raise a crop less than what we had fertilized for? And for the vast majority of the state, the answer to that is yes. Lower than expected yield, or was it fallow? We tend to get mineralization in fallow, so not hard to pick up another 30 pounds of nitrate through the fallow period, just from mineralization that then adds to that total. Certainly, if we're following destroyed alfalfa or clover or anything like that, you know, pretty high likelihood of having a lot of nitrate in the profile. Manure, and then warm late falls and early warm springs, because again, that drives that mineralization process, and so that results in higher levels also.
Question for you. I heard a lot of people saying that if you plant soybeans, it'll produce nitrogen like alfalfa. Is that true?
You know, I think what we find, so that, you know, for a long time, that deal, that, you know, that legume effect. But I think what we're finding more and more with the yields of soybeans that we're raising today, there's not a lot of residual left after them. How do I want to say? Basically, the soybean plant fixes enough nitrogen to make the grain. Okay. Now we do, like in our recommendations, if you're following soybeans, we give a credit for that, but it's really not because the soybeans put nitrogen back into the ground. It's more about that residue. That soybean residue is really low C to N ratio, which means it's going to break down much more quickly, and the nitrogen that is in that residue is going to become plant available much more quickly.
If it hasn't blown away.
If it hasn't blown away, yeah. And if there was much there to begin with, that's actually a conversation we was having earlier this afternoon. It's like, okay, how much credit should we really give if you're following 10 bushel burned up beans, you know?
I've never given any because I look at the soil tests and the nitrogen is not in the profile.
Yeah.
And I might be being fooled by soil tests. But I hear a lot of guys go, oh no, I don't need to use nitrogen for that, you know.
I tend to agree with that strategy. Like when we were doing the field feed work out west, that was always the question we got is, well, how much nitrogen credit are you getting out of growing these peas?
Yeah.
And I never was gutsy enough to take a credit, you know, because we was going from peas back to wheat. And I was never gutsy enough just to reduce my rate on the wheat. My theory always was if there was extra nitrogen there, we'd pick it up in the soil test when we went back to corn or sorghum after the wheat. But I wanted it to prove it. I wanted to see it show up before I would take that.
Oh, reason I'm taking the soil test.
Yeah, yeah. And the same goes for a lot of these cover crops, you know, the idea of, okay, we can raise a cover crop to grow the nitrogen. there's some pretty wild claims out there about how much can be locked away. And again, I'm back to, I would sure want to see it show up as plant available in a soil test before I'd be willing to take that credit.
And building soil organic matter to take advantage of that, nitrification.
Yeah. So yeah, that's whole nother deal. But yeah, on the previous crop deal on soybeans, I mean, I think the fair way to put it today is they grow enough nitrogen for their own needs, but they're not really putting any back.
Well, and
There's actually some argument that soybeans are, if you look at the total carbon nitrogen balance, there's actually some argument that beans are actually maybe harder on the soil than what a grass crop like corn or sorghum is. Because you're basically trading carbon for nitrogen. So, good question. Just being aware of what we took off in removal. We had a lot of questions about, well, how much is there in earless corn silage? Because we had a lot of that chopped out west this year. 30 pounds per ton of dry matter. Corn silage, typical corn silage, about 26 pounds per ton of dry matter. A sorghum silage that actually headed out with grain on it, or a dual purpose forage sorghum, wouldn't be very far off that either. I should add forage sorghum to the charts. So yeah, just we've talked about this a lot already. This just happens to be one snapshot, 1 year in the K-State lab, the range of profile nitrate levels we saw. The range was 4 to 313 pounds. You can see there, just, in general, again, we pick up that bump after fallow. We typically pick up a bump after alfalfa. Notice there that soybeans not noticeably different really than after sorghum or corn or wheat. Some thoughts on it, how to actually do it in the field to get the best results, different thoughts and strategies on this. If you think you're really good, because again, we're often recommending we need a 0 to 6 sample for phos and pH and all the stuff we want near organic matter, all of our near surface measurements. But we want that 24-inch profile to get nitrate, nitrogen. And then I typically recommend, especially if you don't have some prior history, the hardest thing about getting a 24-inch sample is the labor of doing it. Once you got the dirt in the bag, I also encourage people to get it ran for sulfur and for chloride. Especially in this, in general, we're seeing more responses to sulfur across the state. Partly due to higher yield potentials, a lot of it due to how many of you drive a diesel pickup? What type of diesel do we put in the tank now? Ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, right? We used to pick up a lot of sulfur through atmospheric deposition. That now, since we've started cleaning diesel fuel up here 15 years ago or so, we're not getting that. And then chloride's typically been an eastern Kansas issue, but we're seeing more responses to chloride actually kind of along this line moving west. And so Dorvar's had some work up in Osborne and Smith counties where we've had some really nice responses to chloride, both in wheat and grain sorghum. And so I think it's something we need to be, I think it's a good thing if you don't have that soil test history, at least get some baseline numbers to know where you're at. And actually, our chloride recommendations have been lining up really well with what we're seeing in the field trials in terms of response. Typically, a 10 pounds will remedy any of our issues. It doesn't take a lot, but we're in this weird transition area where we get enough moisture and we raise, that we leach some of it out. We've raised good enough crops. We remove some of it. Further east, where they have a history of potash application, it's not an issue because they put on potassium chloride to take care of their potassium issues. So they got all sorts of chloride. But we're in this area where we don't typically put on potash, but yet we might have a need for chloride. So that's something that.
And we're putting on what, DAP and MAP instead?
Yeah, I mean, mostly MAP for here west, but.
I saw a lot of potash. I mean.
Yeah,
I know guys that don't.
But I'd say you guys are right on the edge there, and your sand's a little different. It takes some. I've got guys out of Colby that occasionally tell me they're getting a potassium response. They're putting some potash on. I suspect we're really getting a chloride response.
Cause it's about half and half, isn't it? When you look at what you're getting for a pound of potash.
Yeah, it's or 60/40,
I
something
think
like
it's
that.
like,
Yeah, you get a lot of chloride.
What?
Yes, sir.
I do 8 to 10 inch sample, so you'd actually probably do more of this than the 8 to 10 inch sample. So I just do an 8 to 10 to cover everything.
Yeah, so and the reason we split this up is like all of our phosphorus recommendations and our liming recommendations, potassium, I'm trying to think what else, zinc,
magnesium.
yeah, well, we don't actually give a magnesium rec, but
Oh,
all of our recommendations are based off a 6-inch soil sample, other than nitrate, chloride and sulfur. But for phosphorus, we're all of our database, all of our history, everything's based off a 6-inch sample. So that's why we go 0 to 6 for those types of things, and then 0 to 24 for the nitrate. So what's it mean so this kind of comes back to what if I can't actually get to 24 inches? Maybe I only get to 18 or 15, or I only pull to 10 or whatever. And this goes back to Marvin's question about if it's on the test, do I take full credit for it? Well, if I didn't get a 24-inch sample, I'm certainly going to take full credit for it, because I know my rooting depth, assuming I actually get some moisture and raise a crop, my rooting depth is going to be deeper than that. And that's what even, in our better silt loam soils, even with the 24-inch sample, there's some nitrate underneath there that we're not accounting for, that the plant's going to have access to. And so that's what always gives me a fair bit of comfort in taking 100% of that credit.
it's gonna get there by the time that it's pollinated.
Yeah, by the
At critical
yeah,
stage.
yeah, it might not pick it up early in the season, but we'll get there eventually, because in our deep silt loam soils, at Tribune, we'll see real water extraction at 6 foot in dry land. It's not a lot, but you are pulling some from there. And then, so on the question on like the 0 to 10, how that would affect, like if we're taking that number and plugging it into a K-State recommendation, typically like phosphorus, for example, we have some stratification there. So if you pull a 10-inch sample, that's typically going to result in an artificially low soil test value for phosphorus. And so if you take that 10-inch number and plug it straight into our recommendation, we're going to tend to over recommend how much P you should put on. So just something to be aware of there.
Because the majority of the P being in the 0 to 6 is diluted by the lower 4 inches.
Yeah. And if you're in any type of reduced tillage situation, most of that P is really in the top 3 inches, 4 inches. If you're no-till, we're really seeing some stratification. But even if you're using sweeps or a shallow field cultivator, we're still seeing most of that phos is still going to be in the top 4 inches. And the stuff 6 to 10 is going to tend to be fairly low phosphorus, so it dilutes the sample. Yep. Okay, we talked about, also run sulfur and chloride, how many cores?
What about that last question when you want to talk about labor?
What's that?
And time.
Well, yeah.
To me, how many cores is what's normally compromised by a lot of non-agronomists?
Yes, and some agronomists too.
Have 3 scores.
Yeah. So this just goes back to, and Craig and Marvin have seen me show this slide too many times, but we talk about the importance of getting a good sample, getting a good representative sample. And so one of the things we really stress is, because if you think about, what if I band applied my phos last year, or what if I grazed cows, out on the stalks? And if I'm going out and I pull 5 cores in a bag and throw that in a bag and send it off to the lab, well, what if one of those 5 cores hit an old band of phosphorus or an old cow patty or whatever? Well, you're going to skew that number pretty hard. And so the only way to overcome that small scale spatial variability is to take more cores. So here's a way of looking at this: is this to say, okay, I got my soil, I send it off to the lab, report comes back and it says your soil test phosphorus is 19 part per million. Okay, well, but if that 19, if I only have 5 cores in the bag, this is our confidence interval over here. If I only got 5 cores, it's really 19 plus or minus 5 part per million. Okay, so it could be 14, could be 24, and those are drastically different numbers in terms of how we need to manage the phosphorus in that field. And so the only way to get over that, only way to drive that down is more cores, more labor. Okay. And we've done the economics on this, and actually, even if you value, because your lab fee is the same, charging you X dollars per bag, regardless how many cores are in it. Your cost of getting a 4-wheeler to the field and whatnot's the same. You're really talking about what's the marginal cost of someone's time to pull those extra cores. And so we've done stopwatch trials, talked to consultants, put value on people's time, and even the economics piece of this runs out at about 16 cores, tends to be the economic optimum. Because if you got less than that, you're getting poor quality data. So you're not going to capture as much of the economic value of soil testing. Is basically what that comes down to. But trying to overcome old band applications, grazing of livestock, all those things that could, at a really small scale, throw off a sample. And interestingly, we've looked at this in profile nitrate as well. We've got another study running. We've got sites at Colby, and then down at Boise City, Oklahoma, and Perryton, Texas. And this is on profile nitrate. And interestingly, we find about the same deal. On a 24-inch sample, we're really needing to we'd like to get somewhere up around those 15 cores in the sample to properly characterize what's actually going on in the field at a minimum. So anyways, we won't belabor the details of that. Other considerations with drought, soil pH is another one we often get questions on. Tends to run about 0.1 to 0.4 units higher due to salt accumulation near the surface, especially for surface applying our nitrogen. Generally does not affect buffer pH, but it can change the trigger for a lime recommendation. And we are seeing more of this. We're really watching this is actually kind of in this corridor, but long-term no-till application or long-term no-till history, where we're doing a lot of surface applied nitrogen. We've got some spots up in Smith and Mitchell County where we've got pHs down around 5. That's getting pretty low. That's where we should be liming. Actually, Dorvar's got some studies up there, and we're seeing some really nice responses out of a 1/2 ton of lime application, kind of on the Smith Mitchell County intersection there.
And you're just letting that line lay on the surface?
Yeah, so we're keeping in a no-till system. We're just surface applying that line. And we do get a fair bit of movement, because again, it's back to, this is a near surface issue. Back to this whole stratification thing. It's concentrated, we're surface applying in, so that reduction, as that urea converts, right? We've got the hydrogens that are changing our pH near the surface. But interestingly, we are neutralizing. We put that lime on. We're seeing most of that neutralization happening in the top 2 to 3 inches. We're doing what we need to do without any incorporation. So, but we're picking up some pretty respectable yield bumps, and that field is in they are in a, think about this, corn, sorghum, bean, wheat rotation. And we're seeing some bumps pretty much throughout.
But without some rainfall, that ag line can lay there on the surface for a while.
It ain't going anywhere. Yeah, it ain't going anywhere. And yeah, so it's not moving down and helping us from a neutralization standpoint, but it's also not going away either. So, but anyways, but we can tend to see soil pHs bounce higher during drought condition. We don't worry a lot about potassium here. We're kind of right on the edge of that, but generally those values will appear lower. And that's because potassium is very water soluble in plant residue. But we need some rain, we need some moisture to get it out of the sorghum stalks, out of the corn stalks, back in the soil solution. And we just haven't had that. And then we always see some weird things in southeast Kansas where they have some weird clays down there that really show up in drought conditions. Any other questions or anything on the soil fertility side? I'm kind of shooting in the dark here in terms of what you guys were hoping to get today. The most valuable thing we can do is probably answer questions, especially in a small group.
This didn't fit into the corn and sorghum discussion, but on the winter wheat we've got out there right now, I'm just seeing a lot of lower leaves dropping off, yellowing, even though I know we put on adequate nitrogen, but my concern is it's just not, the plant's not growing enough to find it, and the nitrogen is not moving to the plant.
Yeah, no.
Am I,
No, I think you're spot on. I mean, we saw this a couple of years ago, right? I mean, we, especially guys that had, trying to think what year that was. This is pretty widespread, you know, guys got out there and put top dress on ahead of some snow, thought we were doing the right thing. And then we dried out after that, but it moved that nitrogen deep enough. You know, we had 120, 30 pounds of N out there, but it's all sitting at 5 inches under the surface, and our roots are 3 inches under the surface. And it looked efficient,
right,
but we knew the night, but we weren't rooted into it, and we weren't moving enough. I mean, our transpiration rates right now, even if the roots are there, we ain't moving enough water through the plant to carry the nitrogen to get there. I mean, you gotta have water to transpire to move the end. And we're not there.
well, we're getting a little bit more growth out of the alfalfa, but I mean, it's just powder dry. It's scary.
Well, this discussion about grass and some stuff to burn, and we guys up home over Easter, and we've got pastures blowing up along on the Kansas Nebraska line. I mean, and I went to Amarillo last week, and you get south of Garden City, there's grass blowing.
Well, that's grass that wasn't in the fire, it's just.
Yeah, and that wasn't stuff that was in fire, yeah. No, the stuff at home, we you know, about right out a year ago, we were in a fire up there. And that stuff is really blowing, and even stuff that didn't burn as well.
Yeah,
We talked about not having enough fuel. They had a fire that started the other day up there on Neighbor. That was pretty easy to control, because there ain't nothing to burn. I mean, just almost snuffed itself out.
Yeah, the environmental conditions are really conducive.
There's a lot of fuel.
We just don't do out here. Eastern Kansas, they actually had to do the early season precipitation. They had a lot of early, so they really dried off. And that's where their drought came from. Theirs was a late season bad drought, so they have fuel right now. Plus they have environmental conditions for wildfire.
Well, so I had a question for you on that, and I was gonna ask Owens to be the next time I saw him. You know, on the Wichita News the other night, they were showing you on satellite how much was burning. I mean, in that management system, is there ever, do those guys ever get dry enough? Is there ever a situation where the recommendation is to not burn?
Yeah, if they have dry soil at the start of the season, that they might not. But that's the main reason why we don't want. But my otherwise, if they have a moisture now, they earn their grass will pop out and cover some. So it's just no. Then you're hoping you got some moisture from the opinion. But if you have dry soil to start, that's where you're going to have the problem.
What do you say? I was gonna say.
Yeah, because I grew up.
And I know, talking to my stepdad, we're not turning as much. We typically will just. We're not, we try to go in kind of a rotation. System like we've grown 40 years ago. We're still perfect, it's never be different, step back.
Yeah, question, it's not really.
You know, the Private Burn Association in our county. We give you 5 years, okay, burn days. Are you here in Russell or?
Those kind of applies to soil fertility, but There's been deals floating around about how I think when phosphorus causes less root aggregation. Is that a concern? Or at least the artificial phosphorus, I guess.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, basically, yeah, do we inhibit mycorrhizal activity
And the
and,
use of more like your pivot bio stuff instead of the artificial.
yeah. So I think it's always important to. It's always important to know the context of where some of these claims start from. Because it's like on the phosphorus deal is, you know, in a greenhouse pot study, you can add enough, you know, enough phosphorus. The question is, are the conditions under which phosphorus actually inhibits that mycorrhizal activity conditions that we experience in a farm field? And I think that gets pretty thin to make that jump. The other thing I think that, and I don't have the answer, because the problem is you go to the scientific literature, there's a lot of these things that float around that you can find a grain of truth in a lot of the claims that are made. It's just what's the context though, because the other thing that circulated the last 2 winters has been this circulating deal of if you really want to grow your soil organic matter, you got to quit putting on so much nitrogen. That nitrogen is counterproductive to growing soil organic matter. Well, and the argument is, and there's a little bit, and there's some data out of Iowa that would support this a little bit. The idea is, you know, if you have too much nitrogen out there, you know, you can basically overfuel mineralization, that microbial breakdown, and so you burn up more carbon. But again, it's what's the environment too, because so the flip side of that is, I'll go to, we've got one of our claims to fame is the longest replicated long-term irrigated corn and sorghum fertility studies in the world are at Tribune, Kansas. And so we've got plots there that in 1961, we've got a chunk that's been continuous irrigated corn since 1961 and continuous irrigated sorghum since 1961. And then within that, we got a range of nitrogen and phosphorus rates. So our grade, and so that ground that started irrigating at 60, it had been dry land farmed in a wheat fallow rotation. We're not sure how long prior to that, probably back to the 20s or late 20s. Anyways, when it started, I don't think I got that slide with me. When it started, our soil organic matter was like 1.4, 1.5% in 1960. Our greatest gains in soil organic matter have been at the highest rates of nitrogen. Because it goes back to, if you want to increase soil carbon, if you want to increase organic matter, you have to grow something to convert into organic matter. You have to grow the pile of stuff first. And if you're deficient of nitrogen or you're deficient of phosphorus, you're not going to grow as big a pile of stuff. And so it's really interesting because you can see it when we sampled it at the 60th anniversary of the study. And if you look at organic matter at these different fertility rates, the biggest gain in organic matter came at optimal N and optimal P fertilization, because that's where we were growing the biggest. When I say the biggest pile of stuff, you know, most of the research would suggest that your root biomass, you know, we always think about the above ground biomass, and that's certainly important, but in terms of getting, and I'm getting more into Keith's world here, he can correct me if I'm screwing this up, but as I understand it, you know, in terms of what we actually get converted into long-term stable organic matter, the root biomass is one of the biggest contributors.
I guess that's something to think. I was always thinking about a bit more as these countries are limiting the use of nitrogen coming up, and it's like, well, what sort of things are we gonna have to look forward to if that would happen here, which I'm guessing at some point it's probably going to. Yeah,
I mean, and there's lots of good reasons why we should. I mean, we don't want. I'm obviously not advocating that we should be over applying, but I do get concerned when sometimes at some of these meetings there's broad sweeping statements made that, well, you know, you'll never build organic matter if you're putting on too much nitrogen. And it's like, well, I'm not sure that's true. Our data would not support that. And there aren't very many places that have 60 years of data. And so, but you know, the deal on over application, and not to get on a tangent, that you might, I guess this kind of makes for interesting dinner conversation. You know, where some of this is definitely coming from. You know, in other parts of the country, Chesapeake Bay, you know, the watershed above Des Moines, you know, around the Great Lakes regions, we are seeing more, well, central Nebraska, you know, we are seeing more of a regulatory, you know, type approach to nutrient management. But I think the thing that's interesting here, is we're seeing some things very much come the other direction. And that is, and it's going to come down from industry, from our end users of our grain are very much interested in what's the carbon intensity score of this bushel of wheat you're selling. And so in the last year, we've set in on a lot of meetings where basically what's happening is you got a large baker who is, you know, they're selling hot dog and hamburger buns. They're very much a public facing company. And they're very much aware of, people want to know what's their carbon footprint, what's their sustainability plan, blah, blah, blah. So the bakery, you know, Bimbo Bakeries, for example, go pick up a bag of hot dog buns in the grocery store. There's pretty good chance it's from Bimbo Bakeries when you turn it over. Well, so Bimbo turns around to Graincraft and says, okay, what's the carbon intensity score of this flour you're shipping us? Graincraft turns around to Schooler and says, what's the carbon intensity of this wheat you're shipping us? And the next step of this is Schooler turning around to the producer saying, you know, what are your practices? How much nitrogen is it taking you to grow this bushel of wheat? And that's coming pretty quickly. And I guess you can look at that two ways. On one hand, it's like, I want nothing to do with this. On the other hand, there's a fair bit of money attached to some of this stuff. And for the people who eventually it's going to become the way business is done, I'm afraid. But there is going to be a period of time in there where there's going to be profit to be captured at the farm level and for providing that information. And so we're very much heading that direction. And so, but the good news is, or I mean, I guess what that comes back to is like on some of this nitrogen, you know, the recovery efficiency stuff. And this is already happening in the ethanol business. So the ethanol plant over there at Oakley, you know, they take in both corn and sorghum. In the California ethanol market, corn and sorghum are valued differently because corn-based ethanol and sorghum-based ethanol are valued differently because in their math, they say they have a different carbon intensity score. And so then the common question has been, okay, well, you know, is my wheat going to be segregated versus somebody else? It's like, well, it's just like they're doing in the ethanol business. A bushel of wheat is still a bushel of wheat. A gallon of ethanol is a gallon of ethanol. It's all a paper trade. You know, it's like over there at Oakley, the corn and the sorghum get milled together. The ethanol coming out the spigot at the end, you can't tell the difference between whether it comes from corn or sorghum, but they keep track on the front side. Okay, today we ground 100,000 bushel, 60,000 of it was corn and 40,000 of it was sorghum. So the gallons that come out the spigot today on paper, 60% of them are corn ethanol gallons and 40% of them are sorghum ethanol gallons. And that's how then it gets loaded on a rail car, sent to California, and that's how it gets traded on the paper. And that's we're going to see some of those same things happen in grain within the next.
To the small guy, basically, who maybe can't do all of the things, because you and I both know this is going to become even more intense than what it is now. And there'll be times that some of us, for example, maybe we will be able to do that production, and then someone's going to say, well, I don't want your crop. And yet you've gone through everything that you need to do, but you didn't make a number.
Yeah. So, no, I mean, your point's well taken.
I'm just curious.
No, your point's very well taken. I'll play devil's advocate with you here for a minute. I think there's actually some of these things that the smaller and mid-size operations will actually be able to take advantage of more easily than some of the larger operations.
And how would that even be possible?
Because it's easier to keep track of what you're doing, what your practices are. you're maybe less focused on covering acres and have more time available in your operation to do that
Okay,
work and
but
documenting it.
it still costs us. I don't need to imply that not everybody's paying the same price, because they are, I understand that. But still, as a single operator, your costs, are almost more expensive because it's just you as opposed to being able to spread it out, 8 or 10.
No, yeah, but that's
In the production.
right. That's always the. I mean, that's what's pushed things to where they are, right? We know the economies of scale exist. No, I mean, I think that's a really fair question, but I think for some of these things, there may be an opportunity there. I mean, I think some of the smaller and middle-sized operators will be more nimble and be able to jump on some of these opportunities faster than maybe some of the large guys that, hey, we've got our recipe, we're doing it over 15,000 acres.
Right.
That's a much harder ship to turn than say, okay, I'm managing 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 acres. I've got a much more much more intimate knowledge of my practices. It's easier for me to do that documentation. The other thing is, some of these things, like on this nitrogen efficiency thing, there's some of these things, there could be enough money at play that I think could actually benefit small, medium operators, and the fact that you actually could help some of these capital, some of the capital investment, it's like, okay, maybe I couldn't justify the expense of a Coulter fertilizer applicator before. But now if I can capture a 25% premium on my wheat, because I'm injecting my nitrogen instead of broadcasting it on, well, now, I mean, that makes it, I don't want to use the word easy, but it makes it, but it is a step towards making a capital investment to do that otherwise a small operation may not even been in the picture.
What data reached these bread manufacturers to make them think that this was so important? Are they using it in their advertising? Is there a portion of the public that?
Well, it's advertising, marketing, or if you've been paying attention, the SEC for publicly traded companies, they're looking after what's their ESG score, right? Environmental, social, and governance. And so I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I think this is a great deal.
Right.
I'm certainly not promoting it, but I think it's a reality in the world that we live in today, is that there's people demanding this information.
But who are those people? Because I don't know exactly how to say this. You can go to Europe and you can talk to the same people just like us. And you can work with them, especially in the cattle industry. And when they hear that ESG score, they get panicked. And their first comments are, that means I won't be able to sell my product. Or I can't get money now for a loan. And that's coming here to America, and everyone that we talk about it, it's like, oh, it's okay, it's gonna be fine. No, it isn't going to be fine. We've already seen 2 banks that have failed. Other banks in this area are being bought out. And people who normally had that money invested have now pulled away.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I gotta be careful not to get too political, but there's really, I think there's 2 different pieces of it. You got the public facing piece, you've got a segment of the consumer who wants to know they're buying goods from a, regenerative, renewable, sustainable, insert whatever buzzword you like. There's the direct consumer facing piece of it. But then on the ESG side of it, that's really being driven more by, these mutual fund managers or people, and on the investment side of the business that take it as part of this is, they think it's important. So that shifts where money goes, and money makes decisions. So, but anyways, yeah, very, very good questions and conversation. And like I say, certainly not my intent to promote this as a good thing. I just, from where I'm sitting, some of this is coming faster than, and it's not all bad. There's going to be an opportunity. Actually, people want to talk about this whole carbon credit in the soil thing. I think there's way more money on the table on some of this carbon intensity of grain than there is on the soil carbon stuff. And the other piece of that is we can actually defend and measure carbon intensity on grain a heck of a lot easier than they can measure the soil carbon banking scheme.
So what would happen if they ever start considering the carbon that goes, like you said, in diesel to drive the tractor?
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're
Oh,
talking,
it is.
that carbon intensity score is basically what's the total energy input
From the time the seed goes in the ground.
to grow bushel of whatever. And that's where this nitrogen management thing comes back into this, because nitrogen
Yeah.
is making nitrogen is an energy intensive process. And hauling it is an energy
Well, and
intensive
nitrogen
process.
oxide getting into the air is.
Well, that's a whole other deal, 'cause that's a
Yeah.
direct greenhouse gas. But that's why there's money at play here, and that's why, I really think we're within 3 years of differential pricing on grain, whether you broadcast urea or whether you injected UAN. There's gonna be an opportunity, those structures will be in place to capture that
Which
price.
leads to a lot more data management. I mean, somebody keeping track of how is that guy working on his farm?
Did you actually do what you said you did?
Yeah.
Yeah. So. All right, that was kind of an interesting aside. Sorry, Craig. You're paying me by the minute, right? I'll just hit a few highlights. And like I said, typically I always feel like I'm a little far east to talk about some of our long-term rotation and tillage data, but in light of the drought, I do think there's a few interesting tidbits in here. So this is largely data from out of Tribune. Alan Schlegel's out there 36 years. I worked for Alan. He retired a little over a year ago, and I'm in the interim there. So we've got some really interesting things we want to talk about. My disclaimer, because I'm going to talk pretty heavily about no-till. Certainly, from what I can see and sense, I think this is probably true in Russell County, but certainly further west, we've lost a lot of acres out of no-till in the last 4 or 5 years. Economics and largely herbicide-resistant weed issues. And so my disclaimer up front is I appreciate how challenging weed management is today. And so I'm not, I know there's reasons people have pulled the sweeps back out. The whole thing provides some information that helps think through some decisions. So this is a very characteristic photo of this trial Tribune. This is Alan started this in 1991. Long-term tillage trials. We have conventional till, reduced till, and no-till. It's in a wheat sorghum fallow rotation. And this is a very, even in good years when we got plenty of moisture, we tend to see this visual difference between no-till on the right. I think this happens to be one of the reduced till plots on the left. This is 2 years ago. He's under a little more stress at that point in time. But anyways, just that's a pretty visual deal. So what's this? When I say conventional reduced no-till, what are we actually doing? And we changed this partway through in 2001. There was a change, but basically in the conventional till, we're doing tillage both ahead of the wheat and ahead of the sorghum. Okay, again, this is a wheat sorghum fallow rotation. In the reduced till, from 2001 to present, we are no-till from wheat harvest till sorghum planting. So we leave that wheat stubble intact. No-till plant the sorghum into the wheat stubble. But in the reduced tillage, we do tillage during that summer fallow period after sorghum, but before drilling a wheat. We're typically doing 3 to 4. We typically do our first round with herbicide, but then we end up doing 3 to 4 passes with the sweet before we drill wheat in the fall. And then no-till is 100% no-till and has been since 91. The reduced till changed in 01. Prior to that, we would do about half herbicide, half tillage, both ahead of the sorghum and ahead of the wheat. Starting in 2001, we moved all that tillage to ahead of the wheat, and then we're no-till from wheat harvest till sorghum planting. So I'm only going to show this is 01 to present data. This is on wheat yields. I can make that go away. We don't see that big of a no-till response to wheat. So we're sitting at, since 2001, we're averaging about 33 bushel on no-till. 27 on the reduced till, 23 bushel on conventional till. I think the one thing that kind of surprises people, you know, Western Kansas, we think of wheat as being our stable, reliable bedrock crop. Our data would actually show that sorghum is by far a more stable crop for us than wheat is. And I think that's, but it's a system. We wouldn't be growing as good as sorghum if we didn't have the wheat stubble to plant it into either. So it's, can't ignore the fact that it's a system. What's more interesting is the sorghum yields, and that's really where we see this response to no-till show up. So our no-till yields since 2001, we're averaging 82 bushel, reduced till 52, conventional till 33. Now, the part of this that is a little hard to swallow, as we've had guys go back to doing some tillage in the summer fallow period, that no-till at 82 bushel and the reduced till at 52. The only difference between those two is tillage being done ahead of the wheat. Okay, remember that in both of these scenarios, the sorghum is being no-till planted into the prior year's wheat stuff. The difference there is tillage being done ahead of the wheat. We're seeing, you know, a very significant carryover effect, not to the wheat crop. We really don't see it show up that great in the wheat crop, but we're giving up some pretty significant sorghum yield by doing tillage ahead of the wheat. And I think that's, and I think that's part of why, you know, we've seen a lot of acres leave no-till, and guys say, well, you know, they look at their wheat yields after that, and I say, I'm growing just as good or better wheat, you know, with the tillage. But this would suggest that it's really in the sorghum crop is where we're seeing the problem. So we've done some economics on this, you know, using custom rates on machinery costs. So what is the cost of, what's it cost? You know, the way we're asking the question is, how much can I afford to stay in no-till? How much can I spend on chem fallow to stay in no-till versus doing reduced tillage? Those assumptions, these assumptions were all current as of about mid-January for fertilizer, chemical prices, machinery hire rates. And this is using, of course, we're off of this quite a bit. The 829 on wheat, 595 on sorghum is what we ran back in January. And this is kind of one way of looking at it. And it shows kind of what we just talked about in the yield. So this is my sensitivity to price. Okay. What you can't see there up there, what the question says is, how much can I afford to spend on no-till fallow compared to reduced till? And how sensitive are we to price? Well, you can take wheat from $4 to $8, and it only changes my allowable fallow cost by about 19 bucks an acre. But if I go from $3.50 sorghum to $7 sorghum, changes it by 103 bucks an acre. Because again, the economics, this whole deal, the economics is being driven by the difference in sorghum yields. Remember, I showed you the wheat yields. There wasn't that big a difference between tillage systems. It's all being driven by sorghum. So that's why we can double the price of wheat and not really change what we can afford to spend on fallow. But if I double the price or halve the price of sorghum, it makes a huge difference because that's what our data says is really being affected. So if we look at just the sorghum piece of it, this is net returns above reduced till by doing no-till. And so, you know, at 450 sorghum, this doesn't, sorry, that header's in the way, it don't show up well. Was that my, oh, okay. So at 450 sorghum, you know, basically our break even, we can afford to spend somewhere using our assumptions. We can afford to spend somewhere around 160 bucks an acre on to keep in no-till and still be dollars ahead over reduced till. And when we survey guys in terms of what they think it's costing them, and you know, be fair, actually, even if you're using your own sprayer, it's still costing you $5 an acre, $6 an acre machine cost to run that sprayer, right? And tractors don't just run for the cost of diesel. Even if we're pulling a sweep, you know, there's actual depreciation involved. So it seems like a lot, but if you actually figure your full costs in, A lot of our guys seem to think they're in that, $100 to $140 range. So you can kind of see, but as sorghum price changes, where that break even is. Okay, what if you don't believe my yields? So as we said, for the last 22 years, reduced till sorghum's making about 64% of our no-till sorghum. Maybe that sounds too good to be true. What if the difference on your farm isn't that big? How would that change the economics? Okay, so what we look at is we got a range of yield assumptions. So we got all the way down here. This is the Tribune data. We're saying no-till sorghum in a no-till system makes 82, a reduced till system makes 52. And then you can make your own Lucas Haag's a liar adjustment. Okay, say that maybe I'm only half right. Okay, you think on your farm that difference between those treatments would only be half as big. So if no-till is making 82, your reduced till sorghum be making 67. Well, you can follow that across, and again, these are a little bit outdated, but at 829 wheat, 595 sorghum, that break even is still around $140 an acre is what you could afford to spend to stay in no-till, if I'm only half right on that yield difference. Okay. Even if I'm completely wrong, even if they're yielding equal on the sorghum, you can still afford to spend $70 to stay in no-till, because there is a little bit of a no-till benefit in wheat. Remember, it wasn't big, but we were still picking up 4 or 5 bushel in the wheat. Okay. So anyway, so I guess, even if you don't think on your farm the results are as big as what we're seeing, even if you only take half that, we're still talking about, a pretty significant economic advantage to staying in no-till.
And you're including everything at that part, how much diesel, the cost.
It's machinery costs, chemical, fertilizer, land rent. Of course, that's flat, but yeah.
So what kind of number were they starting with that they were trying to save by pulling out the iron and due to the weaker systems or tolerance?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to put a number on, Martin. I think some of it's just plain frustration. You make a herbicide application that you spent $30 an acre on the mix and you didn't kill anything, and you had it. And it's like, well, I'm gonna do something I know that works. Yeah.
Dollar value, like you said, you can afford to spend $160. Is that over the course of 3 years? Or is that $160 over 1?
That's during the fallow period. So that
This
was
is during
just during the fallow period. So we're basically looking at from sorghum harvest to wheat seeding.
And that's what you're talking about, the cost of the equipment, the driver.
Right.
and fuel.
It's basically what I'm saying is it's like on that break even. Let's back one. It's like on that break even. Say I'm only half right. Okay, we're on that 50% number. And so we're saying that break even is somewhere around $140 an acre. That's the point at which your net returns for no-till and reduced till would be equal. As long as you're spending less than $140 an acre, you're making more money with no-till than you would be with reduced till. Does that make sense? Does that help? I can spend up to that, and I'd still be money ahead over reduced till.
So was if you can say there was a primary weed problem, whereas in my area, it'd be Palmer, was it kosher out there?
Early on was Palmer, but I would say we've got tools. If you want to, it's Palmer. Kosher, we've got tools for kosher. If you're managing 95% of it is Palmer.
Well, from being in this business, not as long as a lot of other folks, but in the time I've been in this business, timing gives a lot of, I know some guys, big operations that are no-till and are struggling with those kinds of things. And back to what we were talking about, moisture and capturing what falls on your ground, that's going to contribute to the benefit of being no-till.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's we see it show up in yield difference, right? That yield difference is a proxy for better infiltration, better soil aggregates. I mean, the whole bit.
Yeah.
And so
I just, I hate to see guys go back to
Yeah.
beating up the soil.
So I think some of it's economic, some of it's a cash thing, you know. From a cash flow situation, you know, maybe I can cash flow again, I can cash flow putting diesel and tractor I already own and sweeps that are already depreciated versus forking over $45 an acre for a herbicide mix that I don't know will work. And so some of it's cash flow, some of it's just plain frustration, I think. But I'd say it's more Palmer. Kosher, our guys that want to manage kosher, we've got the tools. If you're on top of it, that's not a difficult one anymore, or at the moment, I should say. So, sorry, I'm spending more time on this than I intended. We do got some work going with occasional tillage. And this is really in response to windmill grass. I'm gonna draw a blank, one of the 3-on species. We also tend to
Prairie
prairie 3-on, yeah.
Prairie 3-on, so we probably red 3-on or purple 3-on.
Okay. The windmill grass be the biggest one, and Craig, Sarah's got some trials out here in Russell County on the herbicide side, right? But anyways, wanted to look at, okay, what about occasional tillage? What about doing one pass of the sweeps to either catch a flush of Palmer or some tumble windmill grass? And so this is just a Tribune data. So we've got the same study at Tribune, at Hayes, and at Garden City. So far at Hayes and Garden, they have not seen treatment differences. At Tribune, we did not see treatment differences until just the last couple of years. And our treatments are, so we've got full no-till, we've got one pass of the sweeps in June in the summer fallow period, and then one pass of the sweeps in July after wheat harvest. So either tilling once after wheat harvest, or tilling once during the summer fallow period, or staying no-till. And just in the last couple of years at Tribune, we've started to see it start to break apart on our multi-year average. So on sorghum and our no-till, we've averaged 116 bushel. One pass of sweeps during summer fallow is running 111, and one pass of sweeps during after wheat harvest is running 108. And then on the wheat, only about a 2 bushel difference, but we are picking up about 2 bushel higher wheat yields in the true no-till than with one pass of the sweeps. So it took a lot of years to get us there. And so when people ask the question, okay, I've got a windmill grass problem. If I go out and make one pass of the sweeps, am I going to give up all my benefits of 20 years of no-till? And our data certainly would not suggest that, because like I say, at Garden and Hayes, they've not seen a difference yet. And it's only been in recent years at Tribune, after repeated rounds of this practice, that we've seen it show up. And so I don't think, if you've got a tumble windmill grass problem, you know, one pass of the sweeps is not going to erase 15 years of no-till, in my opinion. And in fact, I'd say our bigger challenges have been, you know, the number of guys I visited with that got a problem that's creeping in on the edge, but I don't want to till it. I don't want to till it. I've been in no-till. And so they don't do anything until 3-4 years later. What could have been done with a couple passes around the outside, now we're at the point we got to sweep the whole court. And so they end up doing something they really didn't want to do, when a proactive approach, we could have got by with a couple passes on the outside of the field.
Well, it does, though. I mean, you mentioned, I don't know if the 3-on you're talking about, but anyone familiar with that panicle on the window? I had it in my yard enough, and then it had blown over against the shelter belt, and it was stacked this high. And I thought, my goodness, I gotta go out there and gather it up and burn it or something.
So is control in the upper 90s with just one pass of blades on windmill grass?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question, Keith. I've seen it be above 90, and I've seen it be 40, you know, and so we think about what are the things we can do, you know, that the root system is really shallow on that. We want to run shallow. We want to do it on the hottest damn day of the summer we can. Yeah, use the pickers so that we can flip, you know, ideally we're running fast, we're running shallow, we're using the pickers to flip it over so they can lay and bake in the sun. Running too deep has been, I think, a common source of failure. Doing it on a cool, damp day is not going to work. It takes the right day and really the right conditions and getting those sweeps set just right. And it can have some efficacy.
It sounds to me like if you're doing it right, I don't think, guys, that. From my knowledge of soil health, that would have a minimal impact.
Yeah.
I can understand how they're sensitive to any soil disturbance. I've heard guys say, if I walk across my ground, I'm disturbed, and I'm not that.
Well, and I'd go back to, if you look at the history of this trial starting in 91, it took multiple years for that no-till benefit to accrue, to build. It wasn't, I mean, it grew with time. And so you think about, in my mind, you think about soil aggregates, I mean, it's an overused word, but in my opinion, it is a more resilient system. And so it took years to build that resiliency. I don't think we're going to tear it down with one event. And I kind of wonder if what we're starting to see a little bit is, okay, it took years to get here. It also takes years to take it the other direction. It's just like, how did we get to these degraded soils? Well, we farmed them hard with lots of tillage, not for a few years, but decades. It took decades, to really take these soils to where they are. And so it's soils are slow. Just one last thing. I think this is always kind of interesting. I did this, we had a poll system the last time. After which crop do you think there'd be the least amount of water left in the profile? These people might be wrong. Don't let this bias your opinion. We don't grow soybeans out there.
That's a wheat.
Which one do you think would be the most dry, the driest profile at harvest? Corn, sorghum, or wheat?
So wheat.
You got one vote for wheat.
I think it's cool.
Corn. You can also vote for corn and sorghum the same, or corn and wheat the same.
I'd say for corn and sorghum will be about the same.
Corn and sorghum about the same. So here's wheat harvest, 20 years of data.
So, question, when are you measuring?
This be at harvest time, Keith, at harvest of the crop. Yep. So basically thinking about what's our starting point for collecting moisture, going to the next crop. So this is at wheat harvest, 20 years of data. We average at Tribune about 3 1/4 inches of profile water. That'd be in the top 6 feet, at wheat harvest time. That's pretty dry. Here's what's interesting is, so wheat's 3 1/4. In the upper left is sorghum, 3.3 inches, corn's in the lower center, about 3.5 inches. Those would not be statistically different. My point is that essentially, again, we're in a dryland environment, and certainly on these grass crops, we're drying the profile out basically equally between corn, sorghum, and wheat. So we think about kind of what's that starting point for capturing moisture before the next crop. It's all basically the same in terms of where we're starting out. So it really has more to do with what type of residue do we have at the surface and how much rain do we get going into the next crop. One comment on economics. I think this is something fun to think about as you're thinking about your crop budgets and thinking about all different rotations. And this even applies if you're bringing some feed into the mix. How do you allocate land costs? And I'd make the argument, even if you own all your land, you should be, at least in your budget, assigning what is fair market rent, because some people would be better off being landlords and not farmers. And so it's important to know where you're at there. So, this like in a wheat sorghum fallow rotation, if I'm paying $63 an acre, well, I could just, on my budgets, I could just split it evenly among the crops. Each crop has to cover $94.50 because we're in a 3-year rotation, right? Or I could split it by time, where the thing that I really like doing, I think it's good to think about is, what do we actually rent? Okay, what are we learning right now? How useful is land without precipitation? Okay, this might sound a little far out there, but I'd make the argument that what we're really renting is rain. What we're really renting is the opportunity to catch precipitation. If you split the cash rent by precip or by water use, and wheat, sorghum, fallow, the corn's taking about $83 a rent, and the wheat's taking 105, because I'm assigning that fallow period to the wheat. Because that water that we're capturing is supposed to benefit the wheat crop. Okay, so that makes the economics on that a little tougher. Where am I going with this? So one thing we've looked at is intensifying, okay, you know, at least out west, you know, we went from the traditional wheat fallow to wheat summer crop fallow. You know, what's our next step? What if we go 3 crop in 4 years? How's that change the economics? And so this is looking at wheat sorghum fallow versus what if I stack a second crop of sorghum in there? Okay, now we know that second crop sorghum is not going to yield as well as first crop sorghum, at least that's what we see out west. But if you split the land cost up by water use, by precipitation. Okay, so we're saying the wheat starts using water on September 11th, ends on June 25th. Sorghum. And then what if we double crop sorghum, or not double crop, let's put a second year sorghum in. Well, now the wheat's still carrying $83 of the rent. First crop sorghum's carrying $67 of the rent. And that second crop sorghum only has to carry $50 of the rent. Okay, so that changes the economics quite a bit of how good does that second crop of sorghum need to be. It doesn't have to be as good as the first crop because my costs are less. Okay, from a land rent standpoint. That's the same numbers, just some people like to look at it that way. Okay, so we've got a study at Tribune started in '96 looking at these second crop options. What if I go wheat sorghum fallow or wheat sorghum fallow, trying to stick get 3 crops out of 4 years instead of 2 out of 3. In general, what we see is second crop sorghum makes about 65% of the yield of first crop sorghum in the same year. Sorghum into sorghum stalks makes about 2/3 of sorghum into wheat stubble. Okay, those of you guys here that recrop sorghum, does that sound plausible or high or low compared to what you'd see in Russell County? If you recrop sorghum, how would it compare to sorghum planted into wheat stubble?
Oh, recrops way lower.
I was gonna say, lower.
But is it about 2/3, or you think it's lower than that?
I'd say probably you're only gonna get about maybe 40%.
Yeah.
30 to 40.
Okay. So we average about 2/3. What's interesting is the difference in years. You know, we got some years where they're, you know, so what we're looking at here. So on the vertical, that's the yield of second crop. This is the yield of first crop. Okay. So you got some years there where we're like in 2013, 1998, second crop was making right at the same as first crop. Okay. Then you got a year like 2014. First crop sorghum was making almost 90, our second crop sorghum made 7. Well, it had a little more stress. We're at 3,600 feet elevation in Tribune. This stuff made grain. The second crop stuff was enough delayed, it got caught in the freeze. So it made basically nothing. And so a lot of variability there across the years, but in general, about 2/3. The other part of this that's interesting is, okay, this is relative yields. This is what percent of first crop did the second crop make? Okay, and instead of years, we're looking at profile water at the time we planted the second crop. Sort of. Okay. Now, that's not that strong of that's not really look at our regression line there. That's not a real great relationship. And R squared 0.15 is nothing special. But there's something that I think is more interesting here. So this would be a completely dry profile. This would be a full profile. Okay. Which would you rather plant sorghum into, a dry profile or full profile? Full, right? That's not a hard question. Look what happens at the spread as you go from dry to wet. Okay, that tells you something about the reliability, okay, of that second crop versus profile water. Because think about here, if we're starting with a dry profile, we don't have anything in the profile, we're at this end, what are we relying on to make that crop? Rain. How variable is our rainfall? About that variable, right? Okay, but as we fill that profile up, I think that's really interesting how that data starts to group together, and we start to have a lot more confidence in you know, our ability to grow that second crop sorghum. Yeah, Keith,
That's just what's in the soil profile, right?
correct.
But not actual rainfall. If you did it by rainfall, would it spread out more?
Yeah, so each point would have been observed at that same in-season rainfall.
That, well, because what I guess what I'm thinking about is, before you got here, I showed a curve of our pastures and yield under dry conditions versus yield in years when we have really wet conditions.
Yeah.
And it's the exact opposite. Under dry years, we are really have a very low variability, but in wet years, we have a wide variability when it's based on rainfall.
Rainfall.
And not soil profile.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I've not pulled, I've got something kind of like that, but I've not thought about it that way. So how do we get to that profile water at that planting time? You know, this has always been one of our limitations. We don't have a great way of measuring that on farm, but I thought this is interesting. This is a pretty good relationship. This is profile water at planting of the second crop sorghum versus how much rain did we get since we harvested the last sorghum crop. That's a pretty decent relationship. We can come up with a pretty good estimate of what we would have in the profile based on precip during that since last fall's harvest. So anyway, so long story short, we've put some of this together. This is the other piece of it. This is looking, and this is back to first crop sorghum. This would be sorghum and wheat stubble. But what's our expected yield for different levels of profile water at planting time and in season precip? Okay, so these points here, this would be back around Colby, where our in season precip 15th of June to 14th of September. We're somewhere around that 7-8 inch mark. Okay, these different lines represent different levels of profile water at planting time. Okay, so that the blue line's basically a completely bone dry profile. That light blue line at the top, that would be with a full profile. Okay, and so you can kind of see, you know, how much our yield potential is driven by. You know, we don't know what's going to happen this summer, but by knowing what's in the profile planting time, we do kind of have a reasonable idea of what our potential is, right? You can kind of look at, you know, if I'm starting with a half full profile, this would be typical in-season precip, and then it's a matter of what do I expect to happen, you know, relative to that. Another way of looking at that, here's probability of that in-season precip. This had to be from Colby. You know, say, okay, what about say I'm starting with a really dry profile. You know, I'm down here on this pink line versus almost a completely dry profile. Well, what's the chances that I'm going to get 12 inches of precipitation in season at Colby to make up for that? Well, my chances of getting 12 inches based on 120 years of weather data, my chance of getting 12 inches in season at Colby is somewhere around about 7%. We're definitely at the steep end of the curve there, but you can see kind of how you can work some of this through. We've done the economics on this. So here's net returns for second crop sorghum, including, I'm figuring cash rent the way I showed you on that. And what we're saying is the sorghum price is on the left-hand side and yield of first crop sorghum is up here. So basically what we're saying is it's $6 new crop sorghum. If I think conditions are such that my first crop sorghum will make 75 or better, then there's a net positive return to doing some second crop sorghum. If I don't think I can make 75 bushel first crop, then I'm going to be negative on my second crop. Does that make sense? What we're showing here? And again, I'm not sure how well that travels this direction, but maybe it's a thought process that helps you get, you know, thinking through some of these decisions. And you can see how sensitive we are to price. You go back to 475 sorghum. Now I need my first crop to make at least 90 in order for second crop sorghum to be profitable, just from a relative standpoint. So that's kind of a different way of looking at it based on what I got in the profile. And what I think might happen in season at $6 sorghum, anything in that green box, we would consider to be, should be profitable for second crop sorghum, but we don't have very many. If you assume we're going to get average precip, we need to be sitting at about 75% profile moisture to get into that green box. And I don't think we're there. I don't know that we have 3/4 of a profile anywhere.
I didn't know if we had that in the beach.
Yeah, yeah. That's the other piece of this is, yeah, our yield potential of first crop sorghum is being shifted down because of where we're at in the profile. Assuming average precip in seed. So the one last thing, sequencing of rotations, just we've not seen a lot of difference in when we think about 3 crops in 4 years. So you can see here we got wheat, corn, sorghum, fallow, wheat, sorghum, corn, fallow. We don't see any real difference in terms of that sequencing. Just in general, either of those row crops, when placed after a row crop, make about 70% of what it would make planted into wheat stubble. That's basically what we're giving up. Any continuous row crops making about 2/3 of what first row crop on the cycle is making. So, and then the thing that's interesting is had some conversation with people this morning. Continuous sorghum actually ain't that different from wheat, corn, sorghum, fallow, or wheat, sorghum, corn, fallow. And continuous sorghum, you don't got the cost of fallow in there. You don't have to go very far back in history in Southwest Kansas. There was a lot of continuous sorghum. Back in the 70s and so anyways, that's actually not been a bad, I guess I don't know if you can call it a rotation, but it's not been a terribly bad option in our long-term trials. Okay, and no one in here cares about irrigation, so we can stop there.